Hi guys, welcome back to our fourth incarnation of our Blender 2.9 new features lessons. My name is Helge Maus from pixeltrain. Rendering is the most important step in our producing of images, and so improvements in rendering is always something which we like. And in Blender 2.9 we have a whole bunch of improvements. Some are only technical, some are in Cycles directly, which I can show, and some are in Eevee. So I decided to start with the more technical aspects, and so for that I switch over to the website of Blender and the new features to talk really briefly about that. And if you need more about this, you can read this in the release notes. So the first exciting news are NVIDIA news, so only for people having an NVIDIA card in your computer. Now the NVIDIA GPU Optix denoiser is now supported for all the NVIDIA GPUs. So if you have a Maxwell card or higher, so GeForce 700 upwards, you now have Optix in Blender 2.9, which is great. Also, we have now support for CUDA and Optix with NVLink. So this is also interesting if you have really big scenes. So sharing of memory is now there. So if you have an NVIDIA card, this maybe is the thing you've waited for. Then for other people like me, which don't have NVIDIA cards, because I'm a Mac user, I always was. So I'm really happy that now Cycles has an integration of Intel Embree. Embree is a ray tracing framework, and it works not only with Intel but also with AMD CPUs, and it helps in the ray tracing process and it speeds it up. And here you see a little comparison between different Blender files, and the most improvement is here with Agent 327. It's a scene where you have much motion blur, and this is exactly what Intel Embree can accelerate on. So if you have a really blurry scene, something where a ray tracer takes a long time, Embree is really great, and you see how much time is saved through this new technology which is now there. In other scenes, you maybe not find too much improvement, a little bit. And so rule of thumb is if you have motion blur in a scene, Cycles will be much faster now. If you have a scene with a high geometric complexity, many polygons, and also hair, you will see that now Embree helps Cycles to render much faster, and faster is always good, right? So let's switch back to Blender. I talked about Optix, and Optix is a denoiser for NVIDIA cards, but what about people like me working on a Mac and I don't have an NVIDIA card? So denoising is a really important step in the rendering process because Cycles samples, because it's an unbiased renderer. So to understand the denoising process here, I've made this little scene with stuff from Blender Kit. So thanks a lot guys for this great stuff. So if you need assets or materials for your scenes, look at Blender Kit. It's a really cool library and it integrates really nice into Blender. So I've thrown some objects here into the scene, and we can go here now to the rendering. And you see Cycles now starts rendering. And you see it starts really noisy, and then it samples up. So the only artifact you normally get in an unbiased render engine is noise. And the higher the sample, the better the image, or less noise. That's the rule of thumb. But what you see here in this image is that some areas with 32 samples are still really noisy, which means that you have to sample higher. And everything about optimizing Cycles is how to get less samples for good quality. And there are many tricks here. If you go here to samples, for example, you see that the viewport and the rendering samples are different. So if you have time for the final renderer, you increase here the values. Production values can be 500 samples, for example, or even more. And if you want to work in the viewport really fast, you have here 16, and after 16 samples now, at the moment it stops. But there are also other tricks, for example, adaptive sampling. So adaptive sampling is intelligent. It looks around and sees where the samples have to go, and this really helps to get a faster render and less noise. So denoising is the next step. So with the help of a denoiser, you get rid of noise to algorithms, because noise is always different. So if you have 2 times the same rendering, the noise is different, and so, for example, you can remove noise from an image. And Optix is doing that on the GPU. The Intel Open Denoiser does this on the CPU, so for everyone. And in the older version, before Blender 2.9, we had the Intel Denoiser in Blender. So what you had to do is you went here to the layers, then you activated here the denoising data, and then you get layers inside of your image, and inside of the Blender compositor, we have a denoising node which uses these information to denoise the image with the help of machine learning. So a really great denoiser here in Blender which was there. But now we also have the denoiser here in the viewport. So if you go now here, you see denoising, and if you open this up, you have now for the rendering process and for the viewport denoising. We start with the viewport, so I activate that, and then you see the image is rendered again, and it looks first really blurry. Let's take a look here again. So I go out here and click here, and you see a really blurry image, and then suddenly it gets better. So you don't see noise, but now everything is blurry. And another thing which you maybe have seen is that my computer now doesn't react anymore to good. So if I now try, for example, to change here my viewport, yeah, I think while the capturing is running, this is something I can't work. So to really use that, I do now the following thing. I say I want to have viewport denoising, automatic or OpenImage denoise. It's the same here. And then I go to the start sample, and you remember that the samples have counted up. So what I say is I want that the denoiser kicks in if the sampling process has reached, for example, 5 samples. So if you are now working like before, you move around, everything is fine, you see I can work now with any problems. But in the moment we reach now level 5, suddenly you see that the denoiser kicks in. Yeah, here it is, and you see now you get a really nice image, and now every step is again denoised, and you have a really nice image here. And this is, I think, a good production value for me, because now I can really check how the image looks without the distracting noise. So try to find the sweet point for you here, what you want to do here. Another thing which we are now able to do, so I go out here again into the normal material preview, is we can now directly denoise our image in the rendering process. So like before said, we had to do it in the compositor and made a compositing setup. Now you click here, I want to have the render OpenImage denoising here. And if you're now rendering, I have here a camera. So let's render this. You will see that when the buckets go over an area, first it's noisy, and then suddenly the noise vanishes. So you see now the denoiser, you see it here, kicks in and removes everything. Yeah. So this is also a really nice feature from my perspective. So I can now click render and see my final image. If you want to see the original image, you still can go here to combined into this drop down, and here's the noisy image if you want to see it. And here is then the combined one. This is the image without the noise. So this is about denoising, and yeah, the Intel Open Denoising in the viewport and in the rendering. Another feature which I now want to demonstrate here, so I think I want to end this here. I go here into a new scene here, and let's take Suzanne here. If you work with low poly objects, you may have seen problems when you work with light sources. Let's test this. I go here back into that. I want to have cycles. Yeah, adaptive is okay, but not important here. And now we see that here our Suzanne is now lit by the light source here. So let's go here to the top view. And if I now grab my light source, you will see that this low poly object looks fine because there are facets. But if you now go in here and make a smooth here, you suddenly see that you really often run into artifact problems. Yeah, you have ugly artifacts here somewhere, and to get rid of them, this is a hard thing. And to help with that, we have now a new object base option. So if you have these artifacts and you want to change that, you select your object and then you go into the object settings here of Suzanne. And there is a drop down with the name shading. And if you open that up, we have here a new option with the name Shadow Terminator. The Shadow Terminator is a trick where you move the shadow a little bit to the light source. And this can help. So if you have the feeling that you have an artifact somewhere and you want to get rid of that, you can try to play with this option and you see you move your shadow now over, for example, this edge, and yeah, you find then a good spot where you say, yeah, now I can live with these artifacts. So it's a helper. It's not the solution, but it helps, and I hope you find this useful. Let's go into something different. So for this, I need here a new scene. I prepared a little building here, thanks to the building tools, which is an add-on here inside of Blender. And what I want to demonstrate here is how an outdoor scene can look if you have a nice sky model. So let's take a plane here and say it's 100 meter. Here it is. And now we go into Cycles rendering again. It's still Cycles. Okay. It looks really dark. Why? Because the environment here is grayish, and this is something we don't want. So if you now click here this new yellow dot, you remember we talked about these UI changes in our first lesson about the Blender 2.9 features. We can now go here to the sky textures. And inside of the sky textures, we had two sky models, Hossack Wilkie and Pritham. And now we have a third one, which is named Nishita. And Nishita is a sky model which has a single scattering sky model. And it has a whole bunch of really cool functions. And I want to show you what you can do with that. So it only works in Cycles. That's important, not in Eevee. So I look now around in my scene here and you see how it looks. It looks first that we have here on this side the sun, and we see here a horizon line. But the cool power inside of this sky model is here. We have a sun disk, so the sun is visible. To make it more visible, let me help you. I go here into the elevation and bring it down. So sunset. Down. And you see how nice now we get this moody sunset. Nice one. And then I go now here and increase the amount of dust in the atmosphere. And if you read a little bit about atmosphere and how it works, you know that if you have much dust in the atmosphere, it's thicker and more red light scatters, and that's the reason why you get these nice sunsets if you have much dust in the air or water. And yeah, now you see that here is the sun, so you get a reddish sky like you are used to in sunsets, and here is the sun, and you can change the sun size if you like, or you can also remove it if you don't like this. But this is now a really cool setting. So if you go now here to sun rotation and sun elevation, you can now, for example, make daylight simulations here for architectural things which you maybe want to do, and so on. So a really nice system, because this here can be keyed if you like that here through these keyframes. Another thing which is really interesting, so I reset my dust here, reset to default view, is that the atmosphere changes depending on the altitude where you are. So if you go to the mountains or to really high mountains, you will see that the atmosphere is thinner, and so it changes. And we have now an altitude value here. And if you now go in here and change the altitude more, you see you get a thinner atmosphere. And yeah, you really can go out of the atmosphere if you like. So now you are out of the atmosphere. Yeah, I don't know where the limit is. Let's try 60. Yeah. And now you see you're now in space. So it's a really interesting setting pool which you now can use in this Nishita Sky simulation. So really cool from my perspective that we have now something like that. And for architectural stuff, I think that's really great. Another thing which we have now, let's leave this scene again, and we want to talk about hair really briefly. So make a torus here, and let's make it a little bit bigger in size, smooth it, and make really fast a hair system. I want to have it dynamic. Let's try 2000 and wait until we get something. Okay, that's enough for me. And now if you go really close to these hairs, let's switch again here to cycles. You will see that these hairs here are simulated in the rendering. So let's render these. And maybe it would be a good idea to go here and make a sky texture. Yeah. So if you go closer and closer, somehow these splines have to be rendered. And now with the addition of Embree here, we have in the render settings under here now two options. The first one is a rounded ribbon, which is a trick where you get a ribbon around every of these splines, and the normals are so manipulated so that they look round. It's okay, but it doesn't look too well if you have a really close-up. Then it doesn't look right. And we have a new option now here, which is a 3D curve. And one side note here, if you have rounded ribbons here, you see you have to divide your curve by yourself with this subdivision so that you get it round. But if you now go here to the 3D curves, it will take longer. So the render time will increase with that. So let's go out here, switch it over, go back here. But you see, it now divides the curve until they are perfectly round. This is real 3D. And so for close-ups, this hair appearance, it's much better than before. For the people working with really powerful GPUs, one little side note, now Embree is used for these hairs, so your hair scenes may be a little bit slower if you use this new option here. But yeah, it looks now the same on every graphics card. And if you have a scene which comes from an older Blender version and you use this option, the hair will look different because it uses Embree. So that's that. And the last thing I want to demonstrate you now here are the improvements inside of Eevee. So for this, I prepared a little soft body scene. Here it is, and I've baked it out. So we see these softies falling down, wobbling around, and so on. And yeah, let's switch over here to the render view. Eevee is active. Yeah, here we are. And what we now can see here is that we now can add motion blur for hair and mesh deformations. And let's test how it looks and how you see it. The most important step here is that you have to go here to Eevee and activate it here in the render settings. That's the first step. And the next step is that you only see it through camera. So we are in the camera and you have to render it. So you don't see it in the viewport. So I render this out here and we are on slot number 2. So you see here this nice motion blur on the object. And I switch here to slot number 1 by clicking on 1, and I deactivate here the motion blur for a moment and render it again so that you see now the difference. So this here is without motion blur, so old version. This here is with the new version. And you see it looks much more dynamic and cooler with mesh deformations, motion blur. Like I've said, same for hair, so now Eevee is able to do that. And the last thing, which is now new in Eevee, and this is a really great addition, you see here this HDRI, which I've placed around that, but now you can go here to the world settings, and here I can now go in and say I want to have a sky texture. And now comes the bummer. You see, if you add now a sky texture, Nishita is automatically added, but Nishita is not supported by Eevee yet. So what you have to do is you go back to one of these two older methods, so pre-them, for example, or Hossack Wilkie, but these are now supported inside of Eevee. which is great. Now we have a real cool sky here also in Eevee. So that's it for today. So I hope you found something which you like inside of this tutorial. My name is Helge Maus from pixeltrain. If you have more questions about Blender, you want to learn more, you have topics which you want that I talk about, please leave a comment under these videos or write me an email. I will be happy to help and get my head around that. And if you like these tutorials, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Have fun with Blender and have a nice weekend.